Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has unveiled the wall of resistance against Indian oppression in occupied Kashmir. On his visit to Jammu and Kashmir for Yom-e-Istehsal, the Kashmir Siege Day, Khan said the Indian government is unabashedly pushing its Hindutva agenda on Kashmir. Earlier addressing a rally in Islamabad, President Arif Alvi said India's siege of the valley is proof that the Kashmiris have rejected New Delhi's illegal annexation. Pakistan and Kashmiris around the world are observing the day to mark a year of India's siege and communications blackout in the occupied valley. In Lebanon, the death toll from the explosion in central Beirut has risen to 100 with over 4,000 injured. The cause of the explosion remains unclear, but officials have linked the blast to ammonium nitrate being stored in warehouse at the port. The global number of COVID-19 deaths has crossed 700,000 with infections exceeding 18.5 million. Latin America has reported the highest death toll with more than 206,000 losing their lives to the disease. Brazil, the second worst hit country, has recorded over 1,100 deaths in the last 24 hours, increasing the tally to nearly 96,000. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, 15 people have died while 675 have tested positive overnight, increasing the tally to over 281,000 cases. Sri Lankans are heading to the polls today to elect a new parliament. Pre-polls surveys suggest President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's party is widely expected to win. Rajapaksa is seeking a two-thirds majority in the 225-member legislature to implement his economic and national security agenda. And in cricket, Pakistan have chosen to bat first against England in the first of the three-match test series at Old Trafford, Manchester's biosecure bubble. 6 months since their last test match, Pakistan face an in-form England side still fresh from beating West Indies 2-1 last month. Pakistan have drawn their past two series in England. Those were the headlines and detailed stories right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has unveiled the wall of resistance against Indian oppression in occupied Kashmir. On his visit to Jammu and Kashmir for Yom-e-Istehsal, the Kashmir Siege Day, Khan said the Indian government is unabashedly pushing its Hindutva agenda on Kashmir. Khan said he will continue to be an ambassador for Kashmiris whose voices India has tried to silence. Earlier addressing a rally in Islamabad, President Arif Alvi said the siege of the valley is proof that the Kashmiris have rejected New Delhi's illegal annexation. He said India is changing the demography of the valley to rig a possible plebiscite. Pakistan and Kashmiris around the world are observing the day to mark a year of India's siege and communications blackout in the occupied valley. Rallies are being held and a minute silence has been observed across Pakistan in solidarity with the Kashmiris. Pakistan has urged the United Nations Security Council to meet over India's military siege in occupied Kashmir. In a letter to the Security Council, President and Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi highlighted human rights violations in the area and subsequent attempts by India to change its demography. He said India's ceasefire violations along the LOC and belligerence towards Pakistan pose a threat to regional peace and security. Qureshi in his letter also pointed out India's abduction of Kashmiri youth, the ongoing systematic torture and extrajudicial killings. He said these atrocities epitomize New Delhi's brutality in suppressing the resistance movement against Indian occupation for over 7 decades. Pakistanis and Kashmiris living around the world are observing the 5th of August as Kashmir Siege Day. The day marks 1 year since India illegally stripped the region of its autonomy in violation of UN resolutions. A curfew has been imposed in several parts of the region in the wake of the protests planned by anti-India groups to mark the 5th of August as Black Day. Our correspondent Isa Naqvi from Islamabad has more in this report.
5th of August marks a year of unabated terror, unleashed on the residents of what many call heaven on earth. This day reminds the world how it kept silent on the incarceration of 8 million people, young and old, men and women, the sick and even the children.
5th August 2019 will always remain as a very dark day in the long-standing saga of the freedom struggle of the people of Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. The illegal unilateral actions by India seeks to change the ground situation and unleash a brutalization and organized, deliberate, choreographed brutalization of the people of Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir.
During the past 1 year, Indian security forces have been brutalizing Kashmiris with full impunity to persecute innocent civilians, demanding their just right to self-determination.
Powers given to security forces were always draconian, but the new ones that have been given now and under which extrajudicial killings have become the norm, as I said earlier, have taken this brutalization of the innocent people of Kashmir to an unprecedented level. And the worst part is that there is complete impunity with which they operate, and they have, so to speak, blessings of the government of India.
Despite crushing curfew, communication blackout, mass incarcerations and extrajudicial murders, India has been unable to suppress the Kashmiris' call for freedom. Experts say the frustration of Indian government has found a new vent.
Whenever there are frustrations within India, then they sometimes boil over along the line of control or on the border with Pakistan. What we have seen in the last few months is extreme frustration by the Indian troops, by the Indian government.
India has indulged in deliberate, unprovoked ceasefire violations at the line of control to divert the attention of international community and hide its crimes in the occupied Kashmir. This year alone, India has committed over 1,800 ceasefire violations. Since its illegal actions in violation of UN resolutions, India has martyred 214 innocent Kashmiris and wounded around 1,400. But the chants for freedom from Indian oppression echo louder in the occupied Kashmir today. Reporting for Indus News, Isa Naqvi, Islamabad.
The international community has been criticizing India since it illegally revoked the special status of occupied Kashmir on the 5th of August last year. Lawmakers in the US, the UK and other regional and international bodies are criticizing India, urging it to respect Kashmiris' rights. More in this report.
The Organization of Islamic Cooperation was the first to react with concern and reiterated its solidarity with the people of occupied Kashmir. The organization called for the immediate lifting of the curfew, restoration of communication and respect for fundamental rights of Kashmiris. The UN Secretary General said the Kashmir issue needed to be resolved bilaterally and by peaceful means. Also, the United Nations Security Council held a closed-door meeting for the first time ever after India's controversial move. European Union lawmakers also criticized India for changing the constitutional status of the region in violation of UN resolutions. In the UK, a group of British MPs from the opposition Labour Party issued a letter to the Prime Minister demanding that London strongly condemn India's actions. In February this year, India denied visas to British MP Debbie Abrahams after she landed at the New Delhi International Airport. But in stark contrast to New Delhi's arrogance, Abrahams was welcomed by Pakistan and carried out a joint press conference with Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi, praising Islamabad's progressive stance on the Kashmir conflict. Over in the US, a congressional panel said Indian-occupied Kashmir is facing a humanitarian crisis and called New Delhi's annexation a disaster for Kashmiris. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has always been a vocal supporter of Pakistan's stance on Kashmir, and during his address to the Pakistan's National Assembly in Islamabad, he slammed India for its unilateral steps and pledged to support Pakistan. Dissident voices are also being heard from within India, asking Prime Minister Narendra Modi-led government to restore the special status of occupied Kashmir. Human rights activists in India say Modi has tarnished India's secular image by illegally annexing the occupied territory.
International media outlets and newspapers bashed India over the unilateral revocation of occupied Kashmir's special status. On this day last year, Delhi scrapped Article 370 of its constitution and declared the valley a union territory.
India flooded 80,000 troops into the valley, detained thousands, and imposed harsh movement restrictions and communications blackout. Global media slammed New Delhi for its oppressive actions in the territory and called it out on its atrocities. British newspaper The Guardian wrote, "This sudden move will have consequences for India that are difficult to predict." American newspaper New York Times said India silenced the voice of Kashmir before passing the controversial bill. The Independent wrote, "Through this decree, the Modi government has shut the door for a democratic, peaceful solution in Kashmir." Calling out the move, Al Jazeera headlined India's suspension of Article 370 as the darkest day for democracy in the country. Turkish broadcaster, the TRT World, called out New Delhi on its attempts to change the demography of the occupied valley and said it has plunged the territory to new lows.
In India, police brutalities are on the rise as new cases of custodial murders emerge. Official data shows some 800 people have died in police custody in the past 8 years, but no officers were convicted. Protests against police brutalities have erupted in the country after police beat a man and his son to death in June. They had been arrested from Shantankulam town of Tamil Nadu state on charges of violating lockdown restrictions. Charges have yet to be laid. There, it is uncertain whether investigations into the deaths will lead to prosecutions, but 5 officers have been named as murder suspects. In Lebanon, the death toll from the explosion in central Beirut has risen to 100, with over 4,000 injured. The blast sent shockwaves across the city, causing widespread damage even on the outskirts of the capital. President Michel Aoun says over 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate used in fertilizers and bombs was being stored at the port for 6 years without safety measures. He called for a probe into the cause of the blast, with the results to be released within 5 days. Leaders from around the world have expressed sorrow over the tragedy. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan said his country stands in solidarity with Lebanese brethren in their difficult hour. Prime Minister Hassan Diab said Beirut is mourning and all of Lebanon is facing a catastrophe.
What happened today won't pass without accountability. Those responsible will pay the price for what happened. This is a promise for the martyrs and the wounded. This is a national commitment. Facts will be revealed about this dangerous warehouse that has been there since 2014.
US President Donald Trump called the huge explosion in Beirut a terrible attack, but he did not present any evidence to back his claim. Now, moving on, the global number of COVID-19 deaths has crossed 700,000, with infections exceeding 18.5 million. Latin America has reported the highest death toll, with more than 206,000 losing their lives to the virus. Brazil has recorded over 1,100 deaths in the last 24 hours, taking the tally to nearly 96,000.
The Americas continue to be the hardest hit region in the world by the coronavirus pandemic. Brazil has the second highest number of infections and death tolls in the world. Mexico is not too far behind, reporting the second highest number of cases and deaths in Latin America. In the US, President Donald Trump insists that lockdowns are not needed even as the country's cases near 4.8 million. But the news of progress from Novavax vaccine trials has given hope.
We give them two shots. After the second shot, we take some blood. We mix that blood that has the antibodies in it that could be protective, and we mix that with virus, and we see if the virus will grow. And you actually dilute that out, and that can actually give you a measurement of how much antibody you have. And so the striking thing about our vaccine is that it gives you a lot of antibody. It should be very protective.
In Europe, the virus is on the rebound as Germany reported more than 700 cases overnight. France reported a rise in intensive care patients for the first time since April. In Australia, the second most populous state of Victoria has reported a surge in cases and deaths and imposed a strict lockdown.
If we all continue to do as we should, making better choices, then we'll keep our community safe and we will get to the other side of this. The alternative, of course, is these restrictions lasting for much longer than they should.
Meanwhile, in Asia, mainland China has reported a further decline in daily cases, with under 30 cases reported overnight. In South Korea, authorities are fighting to get the virus under control as both local and imported cases rise.
The COVID-19 is on a steady decline in Pakistan with over 254,000 recoveries. The Health Ministry says there are now nearly 21,000 active infections in the country. The ministry said the death count has risen by 15 to 6,014. It said 675 tested positive in the last 24 hours, increasing the tally to over 281,000. The ministry said 872 patients are in critical condition. Sindh remains the worst hit province with over 122,000 infections, while Punjab has over 93,000. Sri Lankans are heading to polls today to elect a new parliament. Pre-polls surveys show President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's party is widely expected to win. Rajapaksa is seeking a two-thirds majority in the 225-member legislature to implement his economic and national security agenda. The tourism-dependent island is struggling since deadly militant attacks last year, followed by the economic setback of the pandemic. Country's election commission has put strict social distancing rules in place to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Votes will be counted on Thursday. More stories to follow, but right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. In Libya, Tobu tribes have filed a lawsuit at the International Criminal Court against Khalifa Haftar over last year's massacre in Marzouk city. In a statement, tribal leaders said the lawsuit seeks to punish those who bombed residential areas in the city. They said the massacre was intentional and alleged that warplanes belonging to the UAE were involved in the raids. On August the 4th last year, 40 people were killed and dozens wounded in an airstrike on Marzouk. Meanwhile, the US says it is deeply troubled by escalating tensions in Libya, warning that any intensification will only prolong the conflict. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien said efforts to escalate the conflict are a risk to collective security interests. Egypt says it has decided to withdraw from the latest round of trilateral negotiations over Ethiopia's dam on the Blue Nile. In a statement, the Egyptian Water Ministry said Ethiopia's draft proposal lacks regulations on the operation of the dam. The ministry said the proposal also lacked a legal mechanism for settling disputes. Meanwhile, Sudan has also threatened to withdraw from the talks, saying Ethiopia insisted on linking the talks to renegotiating a deal on water sharing. China has criticized the upcoming visit of the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, to Chinese-claimed Taiwan. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said Taiwan remains the most important and sensitive issue in the Sino-U.S. relations. He said Beijing opposed any official interactions between Washington and Taipei and had lodged stern representations with the U.S. This will be the highest-level visit to the territory by a U.S. official in 4 decades. Despite having no formal diplomatic ties with Taipei, Washington remains its main arms supplier and strongest ally on the international stage. Beijing deems Washington's recent advances towards Taiwan a violation of the One China policy that U.S. pledged to respect in 1979. China says it does not want tensions with the US to escalate any further. China's ambassador to the US, Cui Kai, said that the world's top two economies should cooperate instead of confronting each other. Speaking at the virtual Aspen Security Forum, Cui urged both nations to learn from history, saying a new Cold War will not benefit anyone. He said Washington and Beijing were continuing collaboration and making progress on the Phase 1 trade deal. Cui said Beijing was ready to solve the dispute over the South China Sea through negotiations with other countries. This follows a surge in bilateral tensions over tit-for-tat consulate closures, media row, and Chinese app TikTok. Iran and Azerbaijan have discussed ways to increase economic cooperation to minimize the fallout of COVID-19. Iran's Economy Minister Farhad Dehpasand and Azerbaijan Deputy Prime Minister Shaheen Mustafayev spoke in a telephone conversation. Mustafayev and Dehpasand are chairing the Intergovernment Commission on Economic Cooperation between the two countries. They called for observing health protocols and leaving the two countries' crossings open for trade and transit exchanges. The two sides also agreed on the importance of expanding cooperation in the energy sector. They also discussed the unification of power transmission networks of Iran, Azerbaijan, and Russia. And that is all for now. For the further updates, you can follow us on social media @IndusTalks.